So hello and welcome to today's Hastings conversation, Vaccine Mandates and Passports, Are They Legal and Ethical? We plan to spend the next hour and a half delving into the many considerations surrounding vaccine mandates. To help us in this task, we are privileged to be joined by a special panel with Lawrence Gostin, Walter Olson, Amy Fairchild, and Francesca Rossi. They will all be in conversation with Hastings Center President Mildred Solomon. We want you, our audience, to engage as much as possible with today's topic and with our guests. So please ask your questions as you have them by typing them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The discussants will take some time later in the program to address your questions. Although you may have the option to raise a virtual hand, please note that we will only be taking questions through the Q&A. If you have a comment or if your question doesn't get answered, I'd encourage you to head over to Twitter, where you can engage with the Hastings Center and our discussants today. A recorded version of this webinar will be available on the Hastings Center's website later today, where you can also find recordings of our previous webinars. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Solomon, who will be leading today's discussion.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this, our 9th Hastings Conversation in the Center's webinar series on the ethical issues raised by the pandemic. Thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us today. And thank you to the Gil Omen and Martha Darling Initiative for Trusted and Trustworthy Scientific Innovation, which is the source of financial support for today's event. We're very grateful. I'd also like to thank the Hastings Center's terrific advisory council, chaired by David Roscoe, for encouraging the center to develop public programming on vaccine mandates, which was the council's recommendation at its last meeting. Just over 60% of adults, almost 2/3 of adults in the United States, are now fully vaccinated or have had at least one shot. But this average is misleading because there are large pockets of the country with far lower vaccination rates. These places and specific subpopulations with high vaccine hesitancy are very likely to experience resurgence of the virus and new variants. Given the mobility of American society, what happens in one place is going to affect all of us. Overall, about 1/3 of American adults are hesitant to be vaccinated. As we explored in last month's webinar, vaccine hesitancy is influenced by many different factors, including geography, political affiliation, and many other issues. Recent surveys indicate that 12% of those not yet vaccinated may well do so in the future, because they are basically saying that they want to wait and see so they can be assured of its safety. They may come on board if we do a good job of creating easy access and well-targeted, appropriately delivered vaccination messages. Another segment, 13%, are outright opposed, saying they will not get vaccinated, and they may be harder to change their views. And then 7% say they will get vaccinated, but only if it's required. So despite great progress, we face major hurdles to achieving population level immunity. Therefore, some experts are recommending vaccine mandates. Yet many states and their governors have outlawed mandates, including various forms of vaccine certification, so-called vaccine passports. So the main question for us today is, should we support mandates? And if so, for whom? And if so, who should require them? Your employer, schools, state governments? Can vaccine certification be designed so that it's fair and privacy protecting? And will these state prohibitions against mandates hold up legally? I've invited 4 outstanding experts in ethics and public health law to discuss these issues with us. We've structured the session in 3 segments. Segment 1 is going to focus on mandates. I'll be talking with Lawrence Gostin. He's a health law professor and a public health ethics expert at Georgetown University, and with Walter Olson, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank. I'm going to provide more background on both of them in just a minute. Segment 2 is going to focus on passports. I'll be talking with historian and public health ethics expert Amy Fairchild of Ohio State University, where she's the Dean of the College of Public Health. and with Francesca Rossi, the head of ethics and artificial intelligence at IBM. IBM recently developed a digital vaccine passport for the state of New York called the Excelsior Pass. Both of these people, Amy and Francesca, will come on screen for segment 2. And then in segment 3, I'm going to moderate a full conversation amongst all the panelists, and then we will open the session to audience questions. Please remember, we're not using the chat function. Instead, put your questions into the Q&A function whenever they occur to you. You can start asking questions right now, and Isabel will be collecting those. Okay, it's time to start segment 1. I'd like to invite Larry Gostin and Walter Olson to join the screen, and I'll tell you a little bit about them once they're on the video. Larry Gostin is a university professor, which is the highest academic rank possible at Georgetown. There, he directs the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law, and I'd like to add that Larry is also a Hastings Center Fellow. He's served on numerous World Health Organization advisory bodies, and he's recognized worldwide for his global health law and ethics expertise. He was at the center of public policy and law through multiple epidemics, from AIDS and SARS to Ebola, MERS, and Zika. He's currently advising the Biden administration, as well as global institutions like the WHO, the World Bank, and Gavi. He served on 2 international commissions to report on the lessons learned from the 2015 Ebola epidemic in West Africa. So happy to have you, Larry. And Walter Olson is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. He's the Robert A. Levy, he's at the Robert E. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies there, and he's known for his writing on law, public policy, and regulation. He's a prodigious author. His books have stirred discussion on topics ranging from workplace law to mass litigation to the state of law schools. He founded the longest running blog on law called Overlawyered, something maybe many of us can identify with. Before joining Cato, Walter was associated with the Manhattan Institute and the American Enterprise Institute, and he was an editor at the magazine Regulation, which was then edited by Antonin Scalia. Okay, so Walter and Larry, let's begin. My opening question is for both of you. And maybe Walter, you can have a go at it first, and then Larry. The ultimate goal in this session is to answer the overarching question, should vaccination be mandated in the US in order to achieve community level immunity? But before you answer what is essentially a policy question, I'd like to know first what ethical principles or values you think should guide our decision. What values and ethical considerations do we have to keep in mind if we're going to answer that question wisely?
Thank you, Millie. And of course, I come at it from a libertarian standpoint. So individual liberty is front and center in what I expect the government to keep in mind and to respect. And so if you look at part of the issue here, which is literal mandates in which every adult needs to troop into a clinic and get the shot, then yes, I start out highly skeptical and dubious about that kind of mandate. But of course, the real world application of the word mandate crosses over into an area where I feel quite differently, because part of the freedom that we are to respect is the freedom of private society, civil society, to protect itself. And that means thousands of enterprises, the cruise ships and the haircutting salons and the dance studios to make their own decisions about whether or not to require vaccination credentials of customers or of their workforce, and allow them to protect their own workforce and their other customers. Now that points in a very different direction. My same belief in limited government, my same belief in allowing the marketplace to work out the different circumstances of different situations locally and in different lines of work, means that I'm very alarmed at the tendency in some states. In Florida, it's already become a law to ban private enterprises from using vaccine certification to get back up to begin to get back to normal by organizing cruises for consenting adults, if you will, where everyone is vaccinated, and that's one of the things that people are after as customers. It means that for those small businesses, Florida and probably other states are going to be telling them, we don't trust you to make the right decision. The government's going to make that decision for you. Okay,
thank you, Walter. So just to see if I've heard you correctly, the main ethical consideration I hear is still a liberty one, but you're saying that you're concerned about government overreach, but at the same time, you think it would be limiting civil society's liberty to act in the ways that private entities want to act. Is that right?
Yeah. And if you drill down a bit on the ethics, why am I a libertarian? Because I don't want to inflict unchosen injury on other people. And to me, I was super cautious and conservative during the last year and a half, because I didn't want to be the cause of making someone else sick with COVID. And it seems to me many of my co-thinkers sometimes overlook that the libertarian position is against injuring people. And that's about as ethically fundamental as you get.
I didn't hear the word. It's against what?
It's against injuring people, and that means it's not only against the government injuring people. It's against people feeling that they can injure each other. And early adopter on all the precautions, precisely because I'm a believer in individual rights.
Okay, good segue to Professor Gostin. Okay, take it away, Larry.
Well, Walter and I, there isn't a lot of daylight between us. Let me just state what my ethical principle is. And I think that the main difference between Walter and I will be what the role of the government is. So, I think that this is really, ethics 101, Millie. Basically, ethics states universally that, individuals who are competent and an adult can make decisions that affect their own health and well-being. It's called, self-regarding behavior. But they don't have the right to put other people at risk. And so you don't have a right to be in a public place, maskless and unvaccinated, simply because you don't want to be vaccinated, because that places other people at risk. And particularly, you might say, well, if somebody wants to be protected, they can be vaccinated. But there are a lot of people who can't mount an immune response to a vaccine. They're immunocompromised in some way. And there are a lot of people in our community who aren't even eligible for vaccinations, the younger people in our communities. And so I think it's a specious argument, both for vaccine passports and for mandates, to suggest that, everybody is their own autonomous individual, and they can do whatever they want, irrespective of the harm that they cause others. And so I do think that it follows that businesses and other entities, universities, can set conditions on a safe return to work or to an educational setting where everybody feels safe and secure. And my only concern with that, and it's a major concern, is the equity concern. That is, it's grossly unethical to give additional privileges to certain groups over others when they have no control over gaining that privilege. That is, when everybody who wants a vaccine can get a vaccine, I think the ethics are much stronger, much more comfortable with equity. So I'm not in favor of, say, international travel passports or international mandates to travel, things like that. Now, let me just talk about government. I have an article that came out literally 1 hour ago in JAMA, which was entitled, I can tell you the exact title, Mandatory SARS-CoV-2 Vaccinations in K through 12 schools, colleges, universities, and businesses. And, you know, in that, we point out, so it couldn't be more timely, we point out that government certainly has the constitutional power to mandate a vaccine. I think, and we do that. We do it at schools. We actually have, you know, proof of vaccination systems in schools, so it's not foreign to the United States. And universities have done it as well. And some healthcare facilities and others in the private sector have required certain vaccinations like influenza of their workforce. So I think government has the power to do it. The private sector has the power, as the EEOC has said. Universities have already announced it in their hundreds for a safe return to work. The question now is whether or not the government should require it, say, as a once you have a fully licensed vaccine, and once it's licensed for young children, whether or not you should include that as part of the CDC's recommended mandatory vaccination as a condition of school entry. We think it's premature to do that now, but I think I could certainly foresee one day that the government will and should require a vaccine. I don't think we're there yet.
That would be the state governments.
That would be the state government. That's exactly right. The federal government has no power to do that.
So thank you so much, Larry. So it's you said you mentioned the EEOC. So for those people on the call who may be unfamiliar, that's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And my understanding is that they have twice, which is quite unusual, twice stated that it is legal for employers to require vaccination. But there is an obligation to respect and make accommodations for medical and religious exemptions. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
And do you
Spoken
both
like a true lawyer, Millie.
I've got a good teacher. So so it does sound like the two of you agree on employer mandates.
Yeah, I mean, and I tend not to think of them as mandates. I mean, although that they are basically, you know, it's been a long tradition that employers or businesses can set conditions on either return to work or for their customers. No mask, no shirt, no shoes, no service. And so absent a state law, they can do that. And I have the same concerns as Walter about these state laws. The Florida position actually isn't a law. It's an executive order by the governor, but there are a few states that do have legislation. And so I think it's a mistake to prevent an employer or others from having a safe workplace. It seems to me that, you know, if I'm running a university or I'm running a business, and it's my responsibility to keep my entire community, my customers, my employees, my staff, my students safe, that it's not unreasonable for me to ask that everyone who enters the workplace or the school is vaccinated. And there are other ways to keep people safe. You can have very rigorous testing protocols and masking, but that becomes difficult. And as we've seen, those aren't all that safe because universities have experienced hundreds of thousands of infections when they were having those kinds of protocols. So vaccination is a good way to keep people safe.
So just to put a finer point on it, why is it okay for employers to make this requirement and not the government? Is that just because of a political stance we take towards government, or is there an ethical reason why these are somehow different? I do think you might differ on this one.
Ethically, to me, they're very, very different because everyone knows when they go to work for a particular employer that they are giving up certain options, such as standing on the street corner denouncing that employer, might make you unpopular with the boss, or insisting on not showing up at the office. Everyone knows there are conditions, but there aren't such conditions simply by being an American citizen. You didn't take on any of these extra things, and that's why, although I agree with a lot of what Professor Gostin said, I would just point out the legal situation is a little complicated as a constitutional matter. We know that in the Jacobson versus Massachusetts case, the Supreme Court gave states very wide leeway as a constitutional matter. And yet, if you look at the situation pre-COVID, 19 with school vaccination, you find that the great majority of states acknowledged that there were religious and conscience subcultures that they wanted to accommodate. And this was a political balance to some extent. It wasn't that they were necessarily constitutionally forced to, but to me, it's part of America that our pluralism means that we try to make it possible for subcultures that we might not want to join ourselves. I would never join the anti-vaccine subculture, I can guarantee you. And I would want my own son attending university, as he does, which has a vaccine mandate, but I'm not the only person in the country. And I think it's wonderful that America is the kind of place where they will, give you extra room if you are Amish. They will give you extra room if you are a splinter of other sorts. And I think that's the right approach, whether it be public schools. There are hard cases here. There are cases of jury duty or incarceration in which people are going to be forced to be with others over long periods. And I can't say how all of them come out, but where it's possible to accommodate a subculture, even one that I strongly dissent from, I do it.
Larry, do you see an ethical difference between government requirements and employer requirements?
If there is, there's not a lot of daylight between them. The religious and the medical and conscientious objections, the only one that is constitutionally required is medical exemptions. The courts have been very clear that you don't need religious or conscientious objections. Now, with the new conservative Supreme Court, God knows where we'll be. They're very strong on religious liberty, but no, I don't see a significant role. What I'm doing is, as a policy decision in our JAMA article, we basically looked at what the major public health bodies have said about when it's justified to mandate a vaccine, and we didn't think that the COVID-19 vaccine met those standards yet, but they will at one point. So one is that you have robust post-marketing surveillance showing that the vaccine continues to be safe and effective. We've had very short period of time for doing that, and in cases of adolescents, we've had almost no time to do that. And then the second is that there needs to be, greater public acceptance of the vaccine. So I think we will see the day when CDC will recommend, and most states will include COVID-19 vaccines as a condition of school entry. But I don't think we're quite there yet.
Walter, you
remember, we're still under an emergency use authorization.
Yeah.
It's not fully licensed. There hasn't been robust post-marketing surveillance. So I want to have a little bit more time before we rush to a mandate. I think there are other ways to gain widespread vaccination coverage. And if I have a chance during this seminar, I'll explain some less restrictive ways that you could achieve better coverage.
We'll take the chance now, Larry. That's
Okay, I will.
yeah.
I mean, there's considerable behavioral evidence that shows that if you affirmatively require somebody to opt out, and then you make the process for opting out an onerous one, or at least a serious one, that you get less people doing it. So with a religious mandate, if religious an exemption, if you narrow it and then you require some process, you have to show some written documents about why this is part of your religious practice, whatever it might be. And so I think a routine required offering is what I call it, with a significant opt-out process, would significantly boost vaccination rates as people want to get back to kind of normal life. And that's a less restrictive alternative to a full government mandate. But as I say, ethically, I'm not opposed to government mandating vaccines. They do, and they have throughout American history since the colonial period.
So Walter, we know that you are supportive of civil society and employers requiring vaccines. What's your perspective on this, on school mandates? Larry's just made his very plain. And and by the way, Isabel, thank you. She circulated your paper already. Larry, a hot link to your paper already to everyone watching this. So Walter, let me put you on the spot.
Yeah, well, Larry mentioned universities, and I think one of the significant facts to point out is, as I understand it, public flagship universities north of around Virginia or so have generally moved to the yes, we are mandating it for coming back in the fall. And mostly the state flagship universities south of there, I don't know whether you want to call this red versus blue states, have declined to adopt such a mandate. The country is split, and like so many other issues that I wish were not splitting on conventional red-blue lines, this one is to some extent. And so also, one factual bit about the Florida thing is that although it started with an executive order from the governor of that state, the legislature then hurried along to kind of legally give him the basis by passing actual legislation. And that's hard. Unlike
is there legislation in Florida? I didn't think there was.
I believe they sent it to his desk, and I believe he signed it. And of course, that makes it harder because a new governor could revoke an executive order, but it may not be so easy to revoke legislation.
And also, of course, an executive, governors don't have the same powers over the private sector.
So you now have in Florida a sweeping law enacted according to regular order that restricts businesses, no matter how persuasive their case for adopting vaccine credentials, they can't do it. And so there's been a confrontation already with cruise ship lines whose business plan is strongly affected by the possibility that they might have an outbreak, and which have been included several companies that are extremely eager, and of course they're important economically in Florida. Anyway, I promise not to evade Millie's question for too much longer, because she did ask about schools. And to me, where private universities are adopting vaccine mandates, I can't say that I'm all that shocked by public universities doing the same, because they are trying to figure out what most of the families, parents and students want as the proper balance. If they look around and their private competitors are doing the same thing, that's a reason why even a public one might go forward. Go down to K through 12, where attendance is mandatory. The kids are not of age to make the same sort of decisions. And the ethical and political issues do get more complicated. I do favor, as I say, trying to open those relief valves for subcultures. And sometimes that can mean, you can see you're getting to my libertarian streak here. Sometimes that might mean giving them more school choice, saying, we can't take you in the main schools, but here is a voucher to go off and have a specialized school, if you can find it, for people who share your views on vaccination. I'm not outraged by the idea that whether through workplaces or through school, K through 12 schools, there will continue continue to be the institutions that cater to those who don't want to get vaccinated? I'm sure there will. If we were dealing with smallpox with its lethality rate, we could have a discussion about that. We're dealing with COVID, inevitably different balance, much better chance to, especially at the moment with younger people, to not have a breakout to mass fatality.
Okay, I'm sure there's lots more to say about this, and we will get a chance to cycle back. But right now, I'd like to make a transition to the question of whether and how best to certify vaccination. If we're going to have places that are requiring it, there's going to have to be some way to demonstrate that one has been vaccinated. And to move to that, I'm going to invite Amy Fairchild and Francesca Rossi to join us. Hello.
Hello.
Great to see you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us in this event. And let me tell you a little bit about our next two panelists. Amy Fairchild is the Dean and Professor at the College of Public Health at Ohio State. She's a historian who works at the intersection of history, public health ethics, and public health policy and politics. She explores questions right up the alley of today's talk: privacy and surveillance, immigration and border control, and the tension between paternalism or care on the one hand and liberty on the other. She's interested in the potential for government to intervene for the common good, but also the importance of limits. And two of her books that are most relevant: Science at the Borders, Immigrant Medical Inspection and the Shaping of Modern Industrial Labor Force, and Searching Eyes, Privacy, the State, and Disease Surveillance in America, which she worked on with Ron Baer and James Colgrove. Francesca Rossi will be describing the ethical issues IBM has taken into account in developing the Excelsior Pass, a vaccine passport that its client, the state of New York, hired IBM to develop. Ms. Rossi is IBM's Artificial Intelligence Ethics Global Leader and an IBM Fellow. Her work focuses on ethical issues in the development and behavior of artificial intelligence systems. She also studies constraint reasoning, preferences, multi-agent systems, computational social choice, and other constructs that I have to confess I don't understand. She's a fellow of both the European Association for Artificial Intelligence and the Worldwide Association of AI. And she's been the president of the International Joint Conference on AI and the editor-in-chief of the Journal of AI Research. So welcome to you both.
Thank you, Millie.
Thanks, Millie.
Let me start with Amy. Amy, whether we have a mandate or not, increasingly there's going to be a need to distinguish people who've been vaccinated from those who have not. What do you see as the ethical pros and cons of requiring people to prove their vaccination status? What are you most concerned about as we develop these systems?
Well, sure. Thanks, Millie. And let me preface it by saying I come at this in some ways from the opposite perspective of Walter. I tend not to be concerned about paternalism. I tend not to think that protecting privacy is the ultimate social good, particularly when you're dealing with, no, this isn't smallpox, but COVID-19 is a deadly infectious disease, and that's something we need to keep in mind, and it can't be controlled if we put individual rights and individual responsibility at the forefront of our decision making. My decisions have implications for others in a context of an infectious disease, and that's something that, as a society, we really haven't had to deal with for decades, if not more than a century. So that's one of the things I keep forefront in my mind. So certainly if you begin to talk about required passports or certifications, it's going to raise questions about privacy. It's going to raise questions about potentially coercing people into doing something that they don't want to do. My concerns arise when we begin to think about equity issues. And there I see both concerns and I see both opportunities. So as of yesterday, the CDC reported that we're still seeing substantial differences in terms of vaccine access amongst different racial and ethnic groups in the U.S. As of yesterday, Black people living in the United States, 20% had been fully vaccinated. If you compare that to Latinos, it's 22%. If you compare it to whites, it's 29%. So we're still seeing these huge inequities. So if having proof of vaccination, and here's my proof of vaccination that dates back to 1964, my original vaccine passport to get into school. In some ways we haven't come so far. My COVID-19 passport looks a lot like this, and that's problematic. So on the one hand, we have to recognize that not everybody has the same access. Not everybody has had the same experience with the healthcare system. So within some segments of the population, we have enormous amounts of distrust. And if one of the results of not having access to a vaccination is that I may not have access to social life or public transportation or other public goods, that's going to begin to compound some of these inequities. But we only think of vaccination passports as limiting access to, I would say we're not thinking robustly enough. We have to think of it as a way of giving us entry into, and the whole driving idea behind the creation of vaccination registries in the United States was to be able to see who was falling between the cracks and making sure that they had opportunities to get vaccinated. We begin to see the emergence of disparities in terms of vaccination in the 1920s. So this is a problem that started when we began to roll out vaccinations. We rediscovered it again in the 50s with polio. We rediscovered it again in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when we had the resurgence of deadly measles that was heavily concentrated amongst African-American populations. And if we don't count people, if we don't track people, we don't have the ability to provide for them in ways that we can only really do it at the level of governments, at the level of the state, by making decisions about how to allocate resources. And so certifications are a way to ask who needs this service, who needs this life-saving intervention, who hasn't received it yet.
So you see it as autonomy enhancing because it provides entree to aspects of life that might be blocked from you, rather than autonomy diminishing because it's being mandated.
Yeah, right. And I wouldn't necessarily say autonomy enhancing. I would say equity enhancing. You have the ability to identify communities that have systematically and historically been left out. There's this phrase that we use a lot in the Searching Eyes book: what doesn't get counted doesn't count. So we don't know, if we don't have that way of ensuring that we know who is counted, and that's one of the fundamental problems behind this too. Antiquated public health systems in which we don't have the easy ability to link systems. We don't have interoperable systems. We do have vaccination registries in some states, but public health is still kind of in a technological backwater when it comes to having the kind of infrastructure in place that would really allow us to understand which communities are underserved. So it's not so much about getting into that sporting event. It's about getting the life-saving protection that different communities need.
So your main concern, if there is one, it sounds like you're very supportive of having ways to certify who is and isn't vaccinated. It sounds like your main concern is an equity one. But what about privacy? You've shown us the paper version. The ACLU actually wants to encourage that paper is the primary. They want to have a digital opt-in if you want to do digital, but they want to have a major paper route. And I'm sure Francesca's going to weigh in on the wisdom of that in a minute. But because of concerns about privacy and surveillance. So you've really stressed the equity, but are there other privacy or surveillance or other issues at stake as well?
Well, and I don't want to downplay concerns about privacy. I don't want to downplay concerns about coercion. Those are important, but I wouldn't want to see privacy as limiting a fundamental public good. I wouldn't want to see privacy, which would, and there are technological solutions to some of these problems. And this is just not a technological problem, it's a socio-technological problem. So I would rely on Francesca and health departments to address some of those privacy issues. But my point would be, if we become so concerned about privacy that we limit our ability to protect the public health, that we limit our ability to address inequities, we haven't served the public interests.
Thank you. So that is a perfect segue to Francesca, because I know she has written and spoken broadly across the world about how these systems are socio-technical, not just technical matters. Francesca, could we start just with the basic facts? What did New York State ask IBM to do, and what was your response? And we'll get to the ethics in a second, but let's just understand what IBM took on at the state's request.
Yeah, but so the way we put together this solution for New York State, first of all, let me say that follow the process, an internal process that we follow for any solution that we provide to our customers that raises some ethical concerns. And so we discussed with the offering team, with the team developing the solution within the scope of the AI Ethics Board, which is the internal centralized governance about AI ethics in the company, with representatives from all the divisions. And together, these people, together with the team putting together the solution, we understand together what are the best guardrails, the best solutions that we have to put in place to really address issues like privacy, equity, fairness, whatever it's relevant for that solution. And that's what we did for this solution as well. So first of all, we do not support calling these solutions passports. That's why it's called the IBM Digital Health Pass, because passport seems to make people think that is an official government issued solution for in some international thing, like a passport, right? So usually we use like the pass rather than a passport. Second, we don't call it a vaccine pass, but we call it a digital health pass, because it's not just about vaccination credentials, but also about COVID test credentials. So we don't cover just the vaccine, but also the possibility of having a test and being reported there. So that's the overall, idea of this pass. Second thing is that is completely voluntary to use the digital health pass, like the Excelsior Pass, as the digital form, an app that you download, and you can have the QR code on your phone that you can show, but is only supported by IBM if it's delivered as an alternative to the paper version. So we don't support mandating by any business or any organization the use of the digital version. We only support delivering it when it is an alternative to the paper version. However, the digital version with the QR code is more private because of several solutions that we put in place. So first of all, the information, the health-related information about the individuals are not collected in a big database by IBM, but are remaining where they are in New York State, in the various vaccination or test providers. So we only check that and to get the credential and to encode it in the QR code, but we do not get in IBM all this health information about the individuals, which makes it more private because you just show the QR code together with an ID, because New York State requires an ID, both if you use the paper version and the digital version, to make sure it's you. But then we also, it's more secure because you don't have all this health information in one place. It's still distributed wherever it was before having the digital health pass on any other solution like that. So it's more secure because you cannot hack one single place, one single database. And then we also make sure that it is interoperable. So if for the future, whether you want to combine these solutions with other solutions, we use the open standards for interoperability so that it can be combined with other solutions. So for now, it has been, as you know, it has been deployed with the name Excelsior Pass by New York State since the end of March, I think. As of now, I think there are more than 1 million people who downloaded and are using it. I personally have the digital version and also the paper version. I printed, it's a small card. But of course, it's, as I said, it's much more private. I also have my vaccination card, but my vaccination card contains much more information about me than my QR code that I can show with the Excelsior Pass. So those are the main things, like equity, accessibility, privacy, security. All these issues were considered, solutions were found. Some of them are technical, others are not technical, like the availability of paper and also digital solutions. But overall, in one internal mechanism that really looks at all this from all the divisions of the company together.
You mentioned interoperability. One of the concerns that I've read is that people are worried that these digital passes will become Trojan horses for other forms of surveillance or information about patients that goes beyond this one use. And it seems like you're actually designing it so it could be for broader than COVID vaccination.
There is no collection of health information. If the health information of the people remains where people are, there is no collection of location data about the people, where they are. So that this digital solution does not collect any form of information. It only checks the information, but it leaves it where it is already in New York State.
It basically reads information supplied to it by the vaccine providers. So CVS sent my name
or the test providers. Yeah, and then test providers. And then it gives an expiration date, if you in the Excelsior Pass, that is related to the protection that you have, whether it's a vaccine or whether it's a test. The expiration date is related to the kind of mechanism you have for protection.
So we've just heard the ethics considerations that IBM took into account as they were designing this solution. I want to bring back in Walter and Larry and ask the three of you, Amy, Walter, and Larry, does this description from, let's all put Francesca on the spot, and let's ask any questions you might have about that design. Do you feel gratified by what you've heard, or do you still have some concerns about it? Any one of you?
Well, and let me start out by being positive, because one of the reasons I believe credentials should evolve from the ground up rather than from some Washington bureau down is because companies like IBM, with long experience in what consumers care about on privacy and security, are apt to do more user-friendly versions of this, and also there'll be a multiplicity to choose from. I don't think it's crazy at all for critics to worry about, and this includes the ACLU and other groups, to worry about a slippery slope on this, because I can certainly imagine some groups that would press for adding additional categories to a health card, like anti-drunk driving groups, for example, or those who may want to keep mentally ill people away from gun purchases. You could rattle on off many others. And if you look at other types of very powerful information gathering, like police license plate reading or facial identification, of course, you do see these slippery slopes where the initial introduction of the technology can produce tremendous positive good for society, but you have to watch out, especially when it's governments running it. Now, I am reassured by some of what Francesca says about how the information can't be gotten out in a central database, about how in some ways it's disappearing information. Once they swipe you in, it's not as if they have any further access to the information. These are the sorts of things I would like like to see built in. And again, I'm pretty confident that a voluntary competitive system of credentialing in which the customers, namely the different businesses that are admitting people to the movie theaters or the stadiums, they don't want to make it any more legally dangerous than they have to. That will encourage the right sorts of constraints, including withdrawing the whole thing once COVID is made a thing of the past.
Francesca, do you have a response to that?
No, I mean, I just want to reiterate that indeed, there is no collection of information beyond the checking of the credentials. There is no facial recognition. There is no geolocation data, gathering. And that, I mean, those other technologies would be a completely different solution, that is beyond what has been put together for digital health, credentials.
Amy and Larry, any remaining concerns, questions?
Well, let me just add, so one of my concerns is this is only as good as the government databases that underlie it in some ways. So I would still point back to the need to use this as an opportunity to think not narrowly in terms of COVID-19 and digital passports, but to think more broadly in terms of the kind of investments that we do need to make in government systems, because government has accountability that business doesn't have for the health and safety of people. But I'd also raise a concern that was something that was surfaced in the Ada Lovelace report. And I was part of the group that consulted on that. Once this technology is out there, it's going to be very hard to withdraw, if not impossible to withdraw. And for that reason, Ada Lovelace was very adamant. I would say the bottom line recommendation of that group was that governments had to be involved in this, because only governments had the kind of scope and authority to both regulate uses, but also to take account of some of the issues of equity and access that are going to be fundamentally baked into any kind of tracking program.
Thank you. Yeah. The Ada Lovelace report was very comprehensive. I don't know if we can put up a link to it. It was excellent. But one of the points they made was that they were rather cautious about going forward with passes. And they underscored that these are only going to be needed if we don't get to herd immunity, and that they thought then it would be hard to sunset their use for other purposes. I wonder if any of you have any comments on that, that it would, they were saying, why we're focusing on this when we should actually be focusing on establishing herd immunity.
But I think the two problems are orthogonal. Of course, we support a very fair distribution of vaccines to everybody who can or want to be vaccinated. But that's an orthogonal problem to the fact that you may want to make sure that certain properties about privacy, security, equity, fairness, and so on are in the ways of certifying that somebody, hopefully, many people are vaccinated. I understand that when everybody will be vaccinated, suppose 100%, and yeah, of course, you may need less to verify vaccination, but you may need to verify other things, I don't know what. But for now, I think that they are useful. And now there is, in some sense, the urgency of allowing businesses to open again in a safe way, and businesses, schools, like all the organizations that we mentioned earlier. Yeah, so to me, I see the usefulness of these solutions with care put into the ethical issues.
Yeah, I mean, let me just comment on a few of these things if I can, Millie. First of all, I agree with Amy on the underlying data. The United States, one of the impediments to our COVID response throughout was the lack of very good data systems. And on immunization, we do have, immunization data systems in each state, but they're variable in quality. Unlike, almost all of our high income peers, we have no national vaccine registry. That's the first thing I wanted to say, that we do need better data, better surveillance. That's also true with genomic surveillance and other things to track variants. The other important element of this is that, the Biden administration, I think, has done a lot of things right, but one of the things I did not agree with was its simple refusal to be involved in digital health passes or proof of vaccination systems. The administration could have said, well, we don't take a position on uses of proof of vaccination systems, but we will at least provide technical guidance to make high quality, privacy protecting specifications for states, businesses, universities to use. And I think that by doing this state by state, or doing it by private company, and IBM is just one of many entrants to the market, you're just going to have total chaos. The same way we did when we had our location apps, where other countries, particularly in East Asia and even Europe, did rather well with their contact tracing apps, but we were all over the map. And so we've got to have better data systems. We have to have better systems, digital systems, for actually ensuring proof of vaccination or other proof of health status. And I think those two are major deficiencies in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that also the properties of this solution are up to IBM in some sense. IBM decided to put in place those solutions to address privacy, equity, fairness, accessibility, and so on. So you don't know whether another company in another state is agreeing on the same kind of solution or the same ethical issues, or maybe he thinks that some of these ethical issues that we took care of are not important to find solution for. And it's true that in Europe, for example, there has been a better coordinated plan to put in place this, which I'm not sure I know the details of all the properties of those solutions, but it is more coordinated, something that is available for the whole of the European countries. 7 already have adopted it, and so on. So here it's up to the tech company that puts together the solution to state and be transparent, also to say these are the things we put in place to achieve certain properties around these issues that may be considered in these solutions. And so it could be that other companies do not have the same approach or the same capability to put in place even the same solutions.
Well, if the Biden administration has given a pass on providing ground rules or guidelines for vaccination certification, maybe that's an opportunity for the Hastings Center and the O'Neill Center and others on this call to put together a group to offer those. Is there any way to influence that, Larry, do you think? It seems so sensible to have criteria.
I've talked to them, and I think that there may be. I mean, I haven't pressed the point yet. It's interesting because the World Health Organization has made a decision that it is actually against so-called vaccine passports, particularly in the context of international travel. And I actually support that for international travel. I think equity just gets in the way of doing that properly. But even though they're against it, they're developing technical specifications to provide assistance to states.
Technical specs.
So I do think that the Biden administration has abdicated a responsibility to ensure an effective, consistent, reasonably uniform, and privacy protecting system that is effective. So that baffles me. But I think they just thought of it as a political third rail.
If I could jump in, I don't get too many opportunities to praise the Biden administration from where I sit, but I think that their instinct to stand back and allow various types of private development here is in fact the right one. Europe sometimes looks as if it's doing more because it has government initiated uniform centralized plans. The US leads the world in tech innovation in part because we don't do that. And I think that when you talk about what consumers want out of this, it quickly becomes paradoxical because American consumers talk all day about wanting privacy and then sign away their rights all night by clicking the click wrap and signing away their actual privacy rights. Nonetheless, I have more confidence in the resilience should there be an unauthorized leak, should there be an improper use. I have more confidence that in a system of multiple private accreditations, more in tune with, let's say, the credit system, where there are multiple ways of getting credit and credit cards, that consumers will move away from the one that has been shown to do something wrong. If there is one system, that system will, in my view, give us long-standing problems.
I didn't take Larry to say that there would be one system, but that there would be ethics criteria. Sorry, Amy, I stepped on your sentence. Yeah. Please, go ahead.
Well, the thing I would add, so I'm not in fundamental disagreement with Walter. So Walter, you think in terms of consumers, I tend to think in terms of citizens and what we owe to each other as citizens. But if you look at the landscape in the United States, this is a hot button, sexy issue. But only 4 states have done or said they were going to do something. 23 states have either banned the idea of digital health certificates, partially banned, or have legislation out there that's planning to try to do this. 27 others, either the health commissioner or the governor has said they have no interest. So I do think that industry and academia, which has also a kind of a data analytical power that we don't see in a lot of health departments, whether that's a state or local health department, maybe some place like the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. But the real technological powerhouses are the private companies. They are found in Research One universities. But again, I would underscore that the opportunity we have is to drive not the use of digital health certificates, but to drive a very different approach to health architecture in the United States that begins to mirror something like we have in Europe. And the reason that you're going to have by July 1 all of the countries in the EU signing on is they have very, very different health systems. Their public health systems are integrated with their medical systems for the most part, and they have data on their citizens, and their mortality rates are much better, and they're overall not necessarily in the realm of COVID, but as a general approach to public health, they have far more success than this country has had.
Well, it's not final, but before we break for audience questions, which we're about to do, is there anybody with a burning statement they want to make before I open it to the audience? It looked like there were some. Okay, so Isabel has been collecting questions from our audience, and why don't you let me know the first one that you think should come forward?
Yeah, so we've covered so much area in the past hour. So some of these questions may be revisiting kind of older territory that we've talked about. I think there's one general question that has been coming up through different comments that people are making, and it's about the language we're using to describe kind of passports, certifications, mandates, and whether that's the language we should be using. So one commenter says the term mandate is confusing. When we're talking about conditions related to employment, one can choose a different employer, or so to speak. And in academia and the media, we've been seeing passports used a lot. But Francesca, I know you mentioned that New York intentionally stayed away from that word. So what language should kind of the media? Should academicians, and should we all be using to talk about this stuff? Is passport the right language? Are there problems with that? How should we be talking and describing this?
Anybody?
I
in
can jump
particular?
in first if that's helpful. I mean,
Please.
I think a digital health pass or a proof of vaccination system is a better way of talking about it. I prefer proof of vaccination system because not everyone has a smartphone that they can use digitally for these kinds of systems. But I think those are a better term. In terms of mandates, we've traditionally, as Amy knows, we've traditionally talked about, mandating vaccines, in the United States, but that's government run. But it is also conditional. In most cases, it's a condition of school entry, and it's not something that is a general mandate. But in our history, and Amy's the best public health historian there is, that we certainly have had general mandates, including in the Jacobson versus Massachusetts case, which is basically Cambridge, fining its inhabitants if they fail to get a smallpox vaccine.
And I would agree largely. Mandate is a word that should be saved for that last kind of situation, and I would avoid using it for the much more common current questions of whether or not the movie theater can ask you for vaccine credentials. I like the idea of credentials because it reminds people that this can simply be a piece of paper. It doesn't have to be a smartphone. It can be a piece of paper that you show them and they keep no record of it once you're in the theater. And I'm dubious about passport too. I think that it got the discussion off on the wrong foot because people thought of it as a government document that was hard to get or that had lots of bureaucracy and that kept you from going places. We should be thinking in, again, in terms of, and Amy used words about ways of reopening with the right conditions. And I do think we should reemphasize that satisfying the people who are putting on the show, if it's entertainment, on this is going to get you back out, as we all want to the post-COVID nightly entertainment that we've been missing for so long. That's not a passport, that's the fun that you're going there for.
Yeah, so the reason, as I said, that we called it the digital health pass is because that's not New York's, it's IBM terminology. New York called it Excelsior pass. So the digital health, digital because it's digital, although it's conditioned to be deployed only when there is an alternative that is not digital. So we called it digital, but to remember, also we have to remember that we only deployed where there is an alternative to digital. We called it health pass and not vaccine because we want to make sure that there is enough inclusion in these protection mechanisms. It's not only about vaccine, but also about test results, credentials. And then again, we called it pass because we thought the passport really was giving the wrong impression around government official document and too related to something existing, which is the passport.
I heard somebody say the other day, well, we're not going to mandate vaccination. We're going to treat it like all our other vaccines and require it. So my reaction to that was language does matter, but we also need to be careful not to hide behind language. It's something we've done in public health for a long time. We say, oh no, we're not about paternalism. We're not about coercion. We're about requiring these things for the health of others, not for the health of self. And I think we've been disingenuous in some way when we have some of these discussions. And I do think this is a moment in time in which whether we call it a mandate or a requirement or an extremely strong recommendation that you'll have to have some kind of digital certificate to prove that you've met. I think we need to grapple with the idea that there are things that we need to that we are in fact trying to impose on other people for the health of everybody.
Thank you, Isabel. What's another question that came up?
Another question question we have goes kind of back to the first segment that we talked about. So about, and a topic that kind of came up and was mentioned briefly, but that there's a lot of lack of clarity in the audience. So a lot of people are mentioning, you know, the vaccines we have in the United States are still under emergency use authorization. They're not FDA approved. So people are curious, kind of what's the difference for a mandate either by an employer or by a state government for a vaccine that is just under EUA and doesn't have FDA approval? So what are the policy and legal differences? And then someone was also asking about, you know, especially for people who are worried about long-term safety concerns, kind of how does that difference bear on things?
Okay,
Why don't I jump in on that, Millie? I'll answer it from a legal and a public health point of view. You know, from a legal point of view, you know, it's a little unclear, let me just say that, but I think that it's probably safe to say that employers can require proof of vaccination as a condition of coming back to work, even under an emergency use authorization. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, specifically said that their guidance includes an emergency use authorization. And so employers do not have to wait for a full licensure. Government, however, if you had an actual government mandate, would have to wait for full licensure. Most probably, not definitely, but most probably. The reason for that is the Food and Drug Administration, when it gives an emergency authorization, it has language that suggests that you need consent for doing it. So that's the legal point of view. The public health point of view is that we're in a position where we've never been in a position before in the United States or the world, which is, you know, we've now passed 2 billion doses of vaccines. So it's not being used as an emergency issue. It's a population-wide vaccination campaign, and given all of the huge cumulative evidence we've got from clinical trials, which were much bigger than normal clinical trials, through to the fact that we've had so many vaccine doses administered in the United States around the world, we have a very, very good safety and effectiveness profile. And so we're kind of in that gray zone from a public health point of view. But I think much of this will be moot very, very soon. I expect that by July, there will be a full licensure given to the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, followed by several others in the weeks to come. And certainly by the time that schools, universities, and businesses reopen in the fall, I expect to see full licensure.
Thank you very much, Larry. That was really helpful. We are coming up on the end of the session. We have just 1 minute left. So I thought I would have time to ask you all for a final statement, but that's not the case. Instead, I want to use these 60 seconds to thank you very much. This was a terrific session. I think we saw support for civil society and employer requirements for vaccination, or let's just say proof of vaccination, to use Larry's phrase, and across a wide set of commentators who are not all identical in all their thinking. So I'm very happy that we were able to bring such a rich conversation to our audience, and grateful to all of you for sharing your thinking with us. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks for doing this, Millie.
Thank you.
And Isabel will get the last paper for Professor Gostin out, maybe just in the last few seconds we have. He has sent us another paper from JAMA exactly on digital health passes. So if we have a few seconds before Zoom closes us down, we'll get that out, Larry. Thanks again, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
So I did put that paper in the chat. Everyone should have access. We really appreciate you joining us for this hour and 15 minutes. It's been really lovely. And if you'd like to view this webinar, it will be available on demand in recorded format later today on the Hastings Center's website. So I'd encourage you to share that with your friends, your family, and anyone else who you think might find it interesting. Thank you, and keep in touch.